All right, so last Friday we left off with Hardy Weinberg. And we had these, we went through some of the math to show you how we came up with these formulas. We had two formulas. We had P plus Q equals 1. Yeah, sorry, I got something on the screen I was trying to get rid of. And P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. And where P is typically represents the dominant allele, and Q represents the recessive allele. So I could have, tall versus short. If tall was dominant, big T would be my P, and if little t was short, then Q would be my T, or T would be equal to Q. Here I have an example of, and the reason we do Hardy Weinberg, let me step back a second, is it assumes unrealistic things. And those unrealistic things are shown somewhere before or after. Let's see this slide. Figure out where it was. Yeah. They make these assumptions. They make the assumption that there's no mutations. There is always mutations, but they're making the assumption there is no mutations. That random mating occurs, natural selection doesn't exist, the population is large, and there's no movement or migration. That's the gene flow, that fifth principle there. That is an unrealistic set of expectations for most traits, for most alleles, for most traits. You're going to see that there's changes over time from generation to generation. And that was the example. So we can use this as a yardstick to then say, okay, well, this is our baseline. This would be what the allele frequencies, the values should be if there's no change from point A in time to point B in time. Okay, so we can use that as a baseline to kind of measure any change against. But the reality is, normally there is change. There is mutation. There is selection that's not random. There is mating that's not random as well. And all those things tend to not hold true. So back to my example here. If I can get it to move. There we go. Okay. So I've got a bunch of cute little dragons here. And you may or may not be able to see from where you are, because it's even up close, it's fairly hard to see. You're going to be getting a PDF version of this that you can work with and write your answers down for. But it says, view the dragons below. The winged trait is dominant. Okay. So if the winged trait is dominant, what of all these equations here, P and Q and P squared and 2PQ and Q squared, what is the winged portion? It's going to be not just P, because we're talking about their genotypes. So you're talking about individuals. So whenever you're talking about individuals, you're going to be talking about the this equation here. Okay. So it's not P, but you're close. P squared is part of it, and 2PQ. Yeah. So the ones that are going to be winged are going to be P squared plus 2PQ. And then you're like, oh, that's math. We don't want to do math. Meh. We don't want to do that. But if P squared and 2PQ are the winged, what are the unwinged? They're the ones that can't fly. They're going to be Q squared. So that's kind of the weak point where you can get in and you can start figuring things out. So we can take that value and we can say, okay, let's see how many of these are winged versus how many are unwinged. It is asking you for the ratio of winged to non-winged, and I can count them up: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 14 of them are going to be winged, and it's going to be hard to write. I'm just going to say 14. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are going to be not winged. So this would be out of 21 and 7 out of 21. Okay. So 7 out of 21 are going to be what value? Q squared. That's Q squared. Oh, this is getting really muddy. I'm going to erase this in a second. Let me just do that. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Undo. Can I undo what I've written? No, I can't. Okay. So I said 7 out of 21 are going to be Q squared. So 7 divided by 21. Oh, that's not right. 7 divided by 21 equals 0.33. Equals Q squared. Okay. Can I find Q? Oh, sorry, Nate. Go ahead.
Why is that one Q squared? If so you know how there's the P plus Q equals 1? Why isn't that one just regular Q?
Regular Q. Good question. So the difference in the equations is the difference between phenotypes and genotypes. And, well, more than that, in the difference between who has an allele and what genotype they have. So if you're just talking about an allele, then you're going to be looking at the P plus Q equation. But if you're talking about an individual doesn't have one letter. An individual is always going to have two letters. One allele from mom and one allele from dad. So in this case, the Q squared, they're going to get one Q from mom and they're going to get one Q from dad. And so that makes up that dragon that doesn't have wings. But of that population of the 14, some of them have the recessive allele as well, because there's two alleles. Now, I can figure out how many in the whole population, regardless of what they look like, are either showing or carrying the Q no wing allele. And that's when I would use the P and Q equation. If that helps.
Yeah.
Right. So I have Q squared here, which means that 33% of my dragons don't have wings. Right? But now I'd like to know how many of the population are carrying the Q allele. So how do I figure that out? Yep, take square root. So I take 0.33 and I square root it. And take the square root. And my value is 0.58. Right. Take the square root of 0.33. Did I do that right? 0.33. Square rooted. Yeah. Oh, sorry, it was point. Wow. Oh, it was because I know what it was. We got some rounding error going on. 0.57. So that means that 57% of the population carry the Q allele. So they have the wingless allele. There's actually more people that have that trait than have the, sorry, not a trait. They have the allele than have the, what's the other one? What's the other allele? I have Q and I have P. So how do I find P? 1 minus Q will give me P. So if I say 1 minus 0.57, I get P, which is 0.43. All right. So Q, oops, sorry, not P. P equals point. Some mornings I really wish I have caffeine. 0.43. So now, if I want to, and they do ask for this, I can go back and I can see how many of my winged dragons are heterozygous. Right? They're winged, they're all winged, but how many are dominant, having two letters that are two dominant letters, and how many are a dominant and recessive letter? Right? So for that, I'm going to use my equation p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. And I'm going to, if I want to know heterozygous, I can take that and I can say, okay, 2pq. So I can take 2 times p times q. So I take 2 times 0.53 and take that point times 0.37. And that will get me how many dragons are heterozygous for the wing trait. Okay. And I could plug that in for p squared and I can find out how many are homozygous dominant. Same thing. Okay. Questions? This one is going to tell us how many are heterozygous because I took 2 times p times q, and that is the part of the equation that tells us heterozygous. Or I could take p squared, so I could take 0.43 and square that, and that would give us the number of dragons that are homozygous dominant. Okay. So I can figure out all of that. The weak point is always you want to try and find q or q squared, because once you find that, then you can take the square root of q squared, and then the other numbers fall into place after that. You can find p, and then you can find the number of individuals that have particular traits. Okay. All right, so that's Hardy-Weinberg, and you will have some practice problems on that later. It'll start off with the winged guy problem that we just talked about, and then I'll go from there. I want to move on to, we talked about this before, but we didn't actually, I said it and then we didn't really address it. So now we really are going to talk about it, which is there are 3 ways that you can see a change in a population. One is natural selection, one is genetic drift, and one is gene flow. And natural selection is going to be the only one of these 3 that is always adaptive, always beneficial. Selection results because the environment picks the best fit for that particular to survive in those particular conditions. For example, DDT. If you use DDT, we don't anymore, but it's a pesticide that used to be used. And if you use that on mosquitoes or you use it on fruit flies, what happens is you end up with a population of flies that end up being resistant to the DDT. And because there's a pressure, selective pressure, meaning that all those that are not resistant to it are going to die and they're not going to make it to the next generation. So it's always going to be adaptive. Meaning, what does that mean? It means that it's going to enhance the survival of that population, or it will also enhance their ability to reproduce over time. So if you're only living a short period of time, you're not going to have as much reproductive success. You're not going to leave behind as many offspring. And so that can change the what the generations look like what the population looks like over multiple generations. So that's one way we can change a population. We can also change a population by what's called genetic drift. And this changes a population because of the fact that it is usually a smaller population. And the smaller the population is, the greater the chance that there's a random deviation from what you would predict to happen. And that can be positive. It could help the population, or it could not help the population. But it tends to, one of the big things that genetic drift tends to do is it tends to reduce how much variation there is in a population. And we talked about flowers on Friday. We'll go back to that example here, where I've got 3 different colors of flowers: red, white, and yellow. Or not yellow. Fortunately, they highlighted some of these in yellow, which makes me want to say yellow. Red, pink, and white. But you can see it's a small generation. There's only 5 plants here leaving behind offspring. And in the first generation, there's only one white flower. But for whatever reason, just by random chance, in the second population, the white one was actually pretty successful. But then in the last generation that they're showing here, something happened, and the only ones that reproduced were the red flowers. And it didn't have anything, in this case, it didn't have anything to do with them being more advantageous, with the red flowers being better adapted. They just, for whatever reason, because it was a small population, you could get this effect. And now, are you going to have pink flowers after generation 3? Well, you might, actually, because it's, are you going to have white ones? Are you going to have white ones or pink? Sorry, I wasn't reading the genotype here. They're, what are the alleles here? I don't know if you can see that. The alleles here are all, yeah, they're all CR. So can you have white flowers anymore? Or pink flowers anymore? No, it's fixed. So there's no genetic variation anymore in this population for this particular trait. It's gone. Okay? And that oftentimes is not good, because if you don't have some variation and the environment changes in some way, that could mean, here it's flower color, which is not necessarily that big of a deal, but it could mean bad things for the population. An example of that genetic drift. This is one example. There's 2 types of genetic drift. So this is the first one. This is number 1, the founder effect. Founder effect is where you have a small population that breaks off and becomes isolated from the larger population. So you could think of the finches on Galapagos Islands as an example of that. I'm sure some finches went over to another island at one point, and they didn't mean to be there permanently, but over time, the islands shifted apart away from each other so much that they all of a sudden became isolated from the mainland. And because they were isolated from the mainland, they could no longer reproduce with those on the mainland. And it was just chance that happened. And so as a result, you get this new population that has different alleles from the mainland population. But it's just a small subset that go over, and they just happen to go over by random chance. The second type of genetic drift is called the bottleneck effect. And bottleneck has to do with, instead of a group moving, it has to do with a group being completely destroyed by random chance. I always think of your poor little plant in a field, and there's a massive volcano erupts, and certain plants are just like, boom, just wiped out. And who gets hit and who doesn't is completely random. It's not something that It's like, oh, you're red, I'm going to get rid of you. Oh, you're white, I'm going to get rid of you. It just randomly happens. And what ends up happening is you can have a really big change and also the population in general just really goes down dramatically. So they call it bottleneck because you can kind of demonstrate it with a bottle. And here I have 3 different colors. Those are representing alleles. So I have a blue, white, and a yellow allele for, I don't know, maybe flowers? You have blue, yellow, and white flowers? Seems legit, doesn't it? Maybe. Okay. And there's some kind of catastrophic event that happens, and only a few survive. So as many as can be shaken. It can be poured out of this bottle in a very short period of time survive. So you can think of that again as your volcano erupting, and boom, all of a sudden only a few survive. Yellow allele was pretty rare already, but it was in the population. What happened to the surviving population? There's no yellow. So it's gone. That yellow allele is gone. And because that yellow allele is gone, now you're not going to see yellow flowers anymore. And that, big deal, it's flower color. But it could be resistance to a particular disease. Randomly, the ones who had that resistance are eliminated from the population. And that could be devastating because now when something comes along that could infect it, they're gone. They can't help out the population survive. So this is important when we start talking about humans and how humans have influenced the environment. And we have this kind of a goofy looking bird here. Can't really see it on this. It kind of looks like a pheasant. It's called the greater prairie chicken. Let's just call it a chicken. It doesn't look like a domesticated chicken at all, but I don't want to say greater prairie chicken every time I say it. Back in the 1800s, if you look on the left here, the state of Illinois, all that green was the range of the prairie chicken. It was all over the place. And then in 1990s, you can see that there's just a very small population of prairie chickens. So what happened was humans came along and said, oh, that looks like a great place to build my house. Or that looks like a great place to plow down a field for corn. And so what happened was, and they didn't say, oh, I like that prairie chicken, but I don't like that prairie chicken. So it just happened to be, chance that some of the prairie chickens survived, but the majority of them didn't. Okay. Now, what ended up happening, and this is what's all shown in this table, but basic summary is that because you decrease the population so suddenly and so randomly, you ended up getting, they went from an average of 5.2 alleles for each trait down to 3.7. Why do we care about that? We care about that because, we talk about inbreeding, and we talk about how, inbreeding is going to, it's going to concentrate bad traits. So that was what was happening here. The chickens were all the same, and they were breeding with each other. And a lot of their eggs weren't hatching. So they weren't able to survive because about less than 50% of their eggs were hatching because of the fact that they were too closely related to each other. There was too little variation in the population. Yeah. So, and if you looked at Kansas, where people haven't built up, or Nebraska, where they haven't built up either as much, their hatch rates were, close to 100%. Here's that 50% for the group in Illinois. So, and we see this in things like with fishing, when they start to take seals out of the population. Harbor seals are another one that have been impacted by this. Harbor seals are randomly taken out of the water during fishing when they're trying to get big nets out in the water, and they pull up fish, but they also pull up some seals. And as a result, a lot of the seals don't make it when they release them again. And so that's devastated the population as well because, again, very little genetic variation. What they have done in more recent years is they started introducing prairie chickens from other populations. So they brought some in from Kansas, they brought some in from Nebraska, and they were genetically different. And so genetically different enough that the hatch rate went back up, and now it's like 90%. So in summary, genetic drift, it has most of its effects are only on small populations because it's probably not going to happen in a big population. But because it's a small population, you can have allele frequencies change very randomly. So we lost that yellow flower allele, for example, or probably some type of genetic variation in that chicken. That's actually number 3. Genetic drift can lead to a loss of genetic variation. So because they were so similar to each other when they went to reproduce, they were producing all sorts of eggs that were just not going to make it to becoming a chick. Genetic drift can be harmful if those alleles become fixed. So if now in the population there's no diversity, then that's going to be an issue because now everyone in the population is going to have it, and there's no way to get around it unless you bring in something from outside. Okay, gene flow. Gene flow is another thing that can change a population over time, and this can it can increase genetic variation or it can decrease genetic variation depending on what you're looking at. But it's basically when populations move. So one population moves to another location, to another population. So it's a flow of alleles among populations. Good example would be pollen. Pollen can, travel not very far, or it could travel miles and miles if you're talking about a really windy day. It just depends on the conditions. Here's an example of one where it was actually where it was really needed that caffeine today. Gene flow can affect the adaptation of local environmental conditions. When a species or when a part of a population moves to a different location, it's going to try and adapt to that environment. An example of that is these guys called the Lake Erie water snakes. They're just nasty looking little things. I'm not a snake person myself. They kind of give me the heebie-jeebies, or the willies, whatever you want to have. They just look like gray blobs, I'm sure, from the back. But the ones on the mainland have a band pattern, and the ones on islands in Lake Erie don't. Well, these guys can commute. Commute? I don't know if that's really the word. They can move across the water. They can swim across the water. So there isn't that isolation that we would typically see. So the ones who are on the island have lost a lot of their banding pattern because they're more camouflaged if they don't have a band pattern. However, because some of the snakes from the mainland keep swimming over to the island and reproducing with the ones that are on the island, they still have some that have banding patterns. So it's keeping the island snake population from really evolving to probably the best population it could be, the most camouflaged it could be, because of the fact that it's not completely isolated. So that gene flow, the movement of one snake over to the other island, continually brings in new genes. In this case, it's not good because in doing so, it's making them more vulnerable to being attacked by big hawks and eagles and such birds of prey. Oh, you know what I saw on my ride this weekend? I saw a turkey vulture. They're goofy looking things. Turkey vulture. It actually looked like kind of a big chicken with a red head, and it was like full on looking around like, yeah, go about your business. Don't look at me. I'm not over here eating something really, really dead. And right as soon as I came by him, I'm like, oh yeah, that's there was something really nasty that he was chewing on. But it was kind of cool. I hadn't seen a turkey vulture that close up. All right, so this is going to say the same thing, I think. Oh, yeah. So gene flow. So in that case, it's actually, the snakes are actually kind of decreasing the survival because they're moving. And we'll talk about cases where they can actually increase fitness on Tuesday.